النصر المبين ونعيد الحق إن عبد رب العالمين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
As you may know, at Renovation, we always try to find scholars who are grounded in a faith tradition, whether it's Islam or any other faith, and who can then bring that faith tradition and apply it to the moral and ethical challenges we all face in our culture today, in the Western culture particularly. And so today's topic is actually very much fits that vision of Renovation. We chose a rather provocative title, as you may know, Do What Thou Wilt. It's not a statement, it's a question, just to be clear about that. The statement was actually made by an occultist named Aleister Crowley. And it seems that, a lot of that statement defines a lot of the zeitgeist out there today in the modern culture. Especially in the West. So we hope to have a discussion about what the 20th century philosopher Isaiah Berlin termed positive and negative freedom or liberty, which is the interference or non-interference to individual self-determination, and how that positive and negative freedom maps to Islamic philosophy and other pre-modern traditions, and how it maps to liberalism, which is the modern tradition we live in right now. In other words, we hope to answer a few questions. I'm going to just give 2 or 3 overarching questions that we hope will be addressed today. The first question is it as simple as saying that the traditional approach to represents freedom from sin? And is it simple or too simplistic to say that, as well as to say that the modern approach represents freedom to sin? Does true personal freedom require self-discipline or self-mastery? Or does it mean, do what thou wilt, with no constraints at all on freedom? In other words, is it okay to do whatever we want as long as we don't harm anyone else? Lastly, how do we as believers in a living God navigate and abide by our teachings of theology and ethics, and still authentically participate in modern culture and society? So we've brought together 3 individuals who have given these topics a lot of thought in their own perspective and their own interest areas of study. And the format is very simple. I will introduce each one of them. They'll come up and take their seat here, and then they'll have a conversation for the next hour or so, and then we'll be done. And after that, I'll come back to just thank people, but that's about it. So let me introduce our special guests, 3 of them. I'll begin with Muhammad Fadl, who is a professor of law at the University of Toronto and the former Canada Research Chair for the Law and the Economics of Islamic Law. His research areas include business corporations, economic analysis of law, Islamic law, and political philosophy and theory. He has published numerous articles in Islamic legal history and Islam and liberalism, and has also edited and translated the Muwatta of Imam Malik, which is available at our bookstore. I think they still have some copies. And it's which is the first written treatise of Islamic law. So with that, I'd like to invite Muhammad Fadl to come join us on stage. Please give him a warm welcome. Next up is Hassan Spiker. He's a philosopher and a comparative scholar of Islamic, Greek, and modern thought, and a recent addition to Zaytuna College's faculty, where he currently teaches philosophy and logic. He has studied the works of Plotinus, Dionysius the Areopagite, if I'm pronouncing that right, Areopagite, sorry, and Kant and Hegel at the University of Cambridge, where he received his master's in philosophy and is completing his doctoral studies. He also studied the Islamic sciences, focusing on the school of Ibn Arabi and late Kalam theology in the Middle East for several years, And his new book, relevant to our discussion today actually, is titled Hierarchy and Freedom. And the subtitle is An Examination of Some Classical, Metaphysical, and Post-Enlightenment Accounts of Human Autonomy. And will be released shortly. So please welcome Hassan Spiker. Now I want to introduce our moderator for the evening, who has traveled here all the way from the United Kingdom to be here with us today. Paul Williams studied philosophy and theology at the University of London and is the creator of Blogging Theology, which I hope a lot of you are familiar with. If you aren't, just Google it. It's a popular YouTube channel which introduces academic and scholarly content to comparative religion, especially concerning the Abrahamic faiths. His guests include leading scholars in biblical studies, Islamic and Christian theology, and the philosophy of science from the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Princeton, and Zaytuna College. He's had at least, I think, 3 or 4 of our faculty members on more than once to discuss topics. So Paul has come here all the way from the United Kingdom, so please give him a Bay Area welcome. Yay.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. This is the Islamic greeting, which simply means peace be upon you. The word freedom conveys quite different shades of meaning depending on its context. Many people are inspired by movements dedicated to freedom, sometimes freedom from the shackles of authoritarian regimes, but most often in Western liberal societies, many jealously guard the freedom to live and act, guided by their own consciences alone. When we sit in our places of worship, we're often reminded about the necessity of self-discipline, of constraining the freedom of our lower selves, and about how unchecked freedom, be it sexual or economic, can easily degenerate into licentiousness, to the do what thou wilt creed of the English Satanist, I'm afraid to say, Aleister Crowley. Was he from Cambridge?
Yeah.
Gosh, that's two people from Cambridge here today. And this, not surprisingly, can so often lead to our degradation and downfall. Not the Cambridge bit, but the do what thou wilt bit.
Being from Britain, yeah.
So what we need urgently, I would suggest, is an understanding of freedom that allows us to direct ourselves and our societies toward an authentic common good. Today, I'm delighted to moderate what promises to be a fascinating hour of discussion between 2 distinguished scholars being introduced, Mohammed and Hassan, who have thought deeply about freedom and its role in the world. And I'd like to begin by asking each of you, gentlemen, the same question. Is our great modern stress on individual moral autonomy and freedom, with its philosophical roots in the European Enlightenment, and especially in John Locke's ethics, at all compatible with an Islamic worldview? Can there be a synthesis, perhaps? Or are they simply irreconcilable paradigms with different metaphysical foundations? So I don't know who wants to go first, maybe Mohammed?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Paul. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's a really important question, and I'd like to, caveat my answer by saying I'm not really a philosopher. I'm a law professor. I'm a lawyer. I dabble on the margins of philosophy just because of my interest in political theory. So everything I say should be taken with a grain of salt in that regard. I think one of the questions, or how to answer the question, is going to depend on what you mean by the Islamic tradition, first of all. For me, I tend to view the Islamic tradition as sort of the product of kalam, scholastic theology, and usul al-fiqh and a certain kind of sober Sufism, I would say. And from that perspective, right, I think there are a lot of important points of overlap. If we start from the Kalam tradition, the Kalam tradition begins with the assumption that we are individuals, first of all, right? We start as individuals. We don't know as a member of a community. We know as individuals. We are born knowing nothing, tabula rasa, like Locke says, and we acquire knowledge through deliberation and experience, right? So we learn about everything by applying our reason to the data that our senses provide to us, right? So there's also a very strong strain of empiricism in Islamic theology. And quite significantly, the Mutakallimun say that the only route to knowledge of God, which is our first obligation, is through the use of reason. Right. So taqlid, deference to the going opinion, is not a valid way of knowing God and is not going to be effective on the Day of Judgment, right? So I think the Islamic tradition has a very strong rationalist bent to it, a very strong commitment to the idea of the use of deliberative reason to undergird true conviction, right? And that we have to acquire knowledge through learning and struggle, which I think is a very, which is an important point, common point with the European Enlightenment, yes. Particularly the English Enlightenment. Yes. Now, how that goes, because the European Christians didn't have the benefit of the Quran, right? They didn't have the benefit of the Islamic revelation. So it goes in a different direction because it doesn't have the discipline of revelation that Muslims have. So, I think the great advantage that Muslims offer is that we have a strong commitment to rationalism combined with a revelation that allows for a certain kind of check in situations where the conclusions of reason are equivocal and therefore can result in error, right? And so that's what makes, I think, Islam unique as a tradition, is that it really has both very well rooted in its tradition, right? And that's why I think it provides a kind of balanced approach to the problems of freedom, which we can perhaps
more as a compatibilist approach.
Yes.
The two are compatible rather than...
not just compatible, but thoroughly integrated.
Really?
Right? So in Islam, revelation cannot be justified without reason, right? Because how do you know something is revelation, right? You can only know that it's revelation through the exercise of your independent reason. Your independent reason recognizes God, recognizes the possibility of revelation, and then recognizes the truth of the Prophet ﷺ through reason, not through some kind of, road to Damascus kind of revelation, right? This is, very important, right? So reason is at the heart of all Islamic disciplines.
Okay. Well, fair enough. Hassan, what would be your view?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, just a quick proviso. I'm as Professor Fuddle mentioned, and I'm sure he was just being humble, but I really am a dabbler, so I just wanted to say that. Second of all, I'm shocked to actually be in the presence of Paul, because I thought he was just on TV. So, this is amazing. But,
this is English humour, by the way, so...
Well, we're enjoying very English weather at the moment.
It is very familiar, I must say.
We're feeling at home, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by a statement that I went back to today and that I've always thought was one of the most important things I've ever read by a modern philosopher. Ala wa huwa was it's a quotation from a very famous intellectual historian. I believe he's still at Princeton, but his name's Robert Pippin. And he's one of the great historians, philosophical historians of modernity, or historians of the philosophy of modernity, or not sure what you'd say exactly. But he says the assertion of autonomy is the deepest assumption in modernity's self-understanding. But I take the most fundamental figure to be Kant, Immanuel Kant. There are obviously many other very fundamental, important figures. Locke is one of the most important. And I think that freedom is certainly a noble concept, but it's certainly not. It's an equivocal term. We may think that it means just one thing, but actually it means very, very definite things according to the particular philosophy you happen to subscribe to, your particular environment, your particular fundamental assumptions. I personally believe that we have the concept and the principle has deteriorated in our times for the most part, such that I think Brad Gregory, the great Catholic historian, again philosopher and historian, sums it up. He says in his brilliant book, The Unintended Reformation, that the supreme value in modern liberal societies is free choice per se, right, which might be uncontroversial. The supreme value in modern liberal societies is free choice per se, regardless of what is chosen. That's the key part, regardless of what is chosen. Yeah. And I believe this is the point that has to be cleared up before we can discuss whether obviously it's very broad modern liberal conceptions of freedom and a truly Islamic conception of freedom can be compatible. I think in principle they could be compatible, but that problem has to be cleared up, which I consider to be arbitrarism, which is the idea that there are metaphysical and epistemological assumptions underlying the broad modern attitude towards freedom, which makes it free choice regardless of what it's chosen. And that's not giving you choice, that's dogmatic, because that's saying if you have a criterion, that's a problem. As soon as you have a criterion which you think is an objective criterion, that becomes a problem. Somehow that's hampering free choice.
And that's been a criticism of Kant, isn't it, in his view of ethics, that is kind of without any content. It's devoid of the actual content of the moral choice. It's just an abstraction.
Yeah, I think you can universalize transgender rights as I don't think there's anything. That's precisely the problem with Kant's, that many people have pointed out about Kant's ethics, is that the categorical imperative doesn't have any content. It doesn't give you any criterion whatsoever.
Yeah. So it's actually, in practice, it's fairly useless, some people would say. Anyway. Now, in your new book, Hierarchy and Freedom, which I've had a sneak preview of, thank you very much, Hassan. It's not published yet, but it's out soon.
No, it is published, but it's in press at the moment.
Oh,
I missed the...
You discuss in that book what you call, and I quote from towards the beginning, the following: the vexed philosophical and historical relationship between hierarchy, because you put these in quotes, and freedom in the West. Freedom, although at least in principle a noble word, has become the mother of all banalities in today's culture. Ubiquitous, but strictly never to be defined, and everywhere employed by wisely wagging heads, it's great prose this, to warrant multifarious species of arbitrary and unprincipled human behavior. The word hierarchy, contrarily, is inexorably prone in Western contemporary society to elicit strong negative reactions. So, down with hierarchy in the West. And these are strong words, that's the end quote, Hassan. Could you expand a bit about what you mean in that paragraph? I think it gets to the essence of, that's what you've just said before, actually.
Absolutely. Well, this is very interesting because looking into the history of this a little bit in the process of writing the book, it was just, I found it intriguing, the fact that coupled with the Enlightenment's insistence that freedom was the supreme value and that they were uniquely freeing mankind from bondage, being bound and imprisoned by so-called authority, of all sorts of different types of authority. Even reason, actually, was a type of capital A authority that they didn't like. But certainly the divine right of kings and church hierarchies and things like that. But precisely, freedom was bound up almost irreducibly with the dismantling of hierarchy, as in it was the sine qua non. If you want to have freedom, you have to dismantle the hierarchy. That was the basic understanding, which you broadly find. And this has also been pointed out beautifully by Charles Taylor. It's been beautifully pointed out by Robert Pippin as well. I think it was mostly drawing on Charles Taylor. That the dismantling of the hierarchy was part and parcel of the assertion of autonomy and the assertion of freedom. However, what I feel is that when you look at what I've argued in the book is that when you analyze various Enlightenment thinkers and their attitude towards hierarchy and what it means to them, it's actually, they're very much missing the mark when it comes to if you look at the intellectual pedigree of the notion of hierarchy, they are assuming, broadly speaking, of course, they generally assume that all hierarchy must be conventional and ultimately arbitrary, right? And that's true. I mean, isn't it convenient that we're all here, but one of us just decides that, there's a hierarchy and I happen to be at the head of the hierarchy, and, I'm going to appoint my close friends around me, they're going to be the next rung in the hierarchy, and, the people we don't like are going to eventually be at the lowest rung. Of course, that sounds awful, and that is an impediment to freedom. But the point is, the traditional metaphysical understanding of hierarchy has nothing to do with that whatsoever. It's an understanding that embedded in being, there is an intrinsic hierarchy. The most fundamental aspect of that is simply the superiority of intellect to instinct, right? And so, insofar as human groups and societies and associations genuinely participate in that real metaphysical hierarchy, then there is a real metaphysical hierarchy there. But it's ultimately an inward hierarchy. It's not ultimately an outward hierarchy. And very interestingly, even in medieval tracts like Giles of Rome's tract on political theory, they say the Pope is the head of the hierarchy in an outward sense. He's actually not necessarily holier than anyone else. You would hope that he is, because he is the outward symbol of that hierarchy, but it's possible for him to not be. And so, essentially, these theories of hierarchy were, I'm giving a bit of a long-winded answer, but they were rooted in a very famous, very major 6th century figure, his writings, Dionysius the Areopagite, who's usually known as Pseudo-Dionysius. And he was possibly an actual student of the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, but he was definitely strongly influenced by him, sometimes almost paraphrasing him. It's Dionysius is the key figure here because he's the first great theorizer of this idea of metaphysical intrinsic hierarchy. And he was the one, because he was a great medieval authority, who was invoked in order to justify the idea that this intrinsic metaphysical hierarchy is mirrored in the orders of society.
Right.
But as I've said, there's this fundamental modernist assumption that, that somehow hampered social mobility. There are a lot of interesting studies. I invite you to go and have a look at them, which pretty categorically prove that there was more social mobility in the Middle Ages than there is today.
Really?
Yeah. So, it's just interesting that we've inherited a certain narrative about, very often it's a Protestant narrative about the emergence of modernity and the wonderful good that modernity has brought us as a human race. On the other hand, there are problems with the broad Catholic narrative of the emergence of modernity. One can't really be a blind follower in either of them.
But just to bring in a hadith, if I may, to bring in faith here, I have an amazing Sahih hadith from Bukhari where the Prophet Muhammad, upon peace, said, and I think this is germane to your point, indeed, each of you is a shepherd, and each of you is responsible for their flock. The ruler is a shepherd over the people and is responsible for his subjects. A man is a shepherd over his family and is responsible for them. A woman is a shepherd over her husband's home and children and is responsible for them. Now, for me, as a absolutely non-scholar, not knowing, I'm not giving a fatwa or anything, I'm just saying that strikes me as intrinsically hierarchical. and is not merely conventional in its understanding of the relationship between the subordinate and so on. Would you agree with that, or am I?
I think any traditional society believes in an intrinsic hierarchy. A lot of modernists believe in an intrinsic hierarchy. But there is a bad form of hierarchy, which is arbitrary hierarchy.
Or abusive hierarchy.
Or abusive hierarchy, or one that's not really rooted in reality. And the thing is, that's why I believe it's always really a hidden hierarchy. There is a hierarchy, but you don't necessarily know who it is. But there are symbols of that. There are representatives of that hierarchy who can be good or bad representatives thereof. So yes, there is the father, the head of the household. There is the mother with her particular extremely important role, largely more important than the father's. There is the relationship between children and their parents. But people can do a bad job. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a fundamental intrinsic hierarchy.
Right. Okay. Before we come to the next question, sorry, Mohammed, do you want to comment on what we said?
I'd like to comment. I think that hadith is often cited in support of a kind of natural hierarchy. I don't think it's that simple if you start looking at Islamic law.
Okay.
Right? Now, of course, you can't universalize about Islam because there are lots of different traditions in Islam. So if you look at Shi'ism, I think, is a very hierarchical tradition, right? It posits a kind of sacred family, quite literally, right? And attributes all sorts of kind of superpowers to them. Sufism is also a hierarchy of charismatic religious knowledge, at least in many forms. But fiqh is surprisingly flat. Okay, really flat.
So what do you mean by flat?
No hierarchy.
Right. Okay.
There are gender hierarchies, right?
Yeah.
But among free men, let's just put it this way, in the Middle Ages, it's remarkably flat. So Abu Bakr al-Kastani, who's a 12th century great Hanafi jurist, he refers to the caliph as a rasul. Now, in Hanafi fiqh, a rasul is the lowest form of agent that you can have. It's like an errand boy, right? So he speaks of the caliph as like the community's errand boy, right? Ibn Abd as-Salam, when he's talking about duties of obedience, he says the principle, the foundational rule in Islam is that nobody owes a duty of obedience to anybody else because of this sort of fundamental nature of equality among humans, that there has to be a legal cause imposing duties of obedience, right? So obedience is constructed in Sunni Islam, political theory. That's why I'm saying, again, that's what makes it very, I think, similar to 17th century English Enlightenment thought. Yeah. Because this is the great contribution of Hobbes and Locke, was the idea that you could construct political authority, that political authority wasn't given to you, right? It was a product of human deliberation and choice and design. And so if you look at fiqh books, and they talk about the duty of developing what I call the rule of law, iqamatul hukm. It's something that's delegated to the ruler. The ruler is given the responsibility of designing institutions that makes the law effective. And when the ruler doesn't do it, it devolves to the people to do it, right? So again, this is where I'm saying there's this balance in Islam between sort of freedom/autonomy and norms that are outside of their control. So we have the freedom to create our institutions, but those institutions must vindicate certain kinds of norms, right? So it's not a license to do what you wish, no. But nor is it something in which everything is determined for you.
Okay. Well, perhaps we can move on to another area of contemporary, sort of red button issue, really. There's a question for you, Mohammed. Is contemporary liberalism in the tradition of John Locke and J.S. Mill, two Englishmen again, compatible with the Islamic worldview? Now, I have in mind particularly the question of sovereignty in Islam and the liberal worldview. Just to give it an example, some newly developed liberal concepts regarding gender and sexuality are seen as essential to liberal ethics these days. And ethical conformism is obligatory in many liberal democracies. It certainly is becoming that way in England and some other European countries. I'm less sure of what's going on in the United States, however. So some would suggest that there's no consensus possible between these two worldviews, Islam and the liberal worldview, in this kind of emerging new social order that we're now forced to participate in a way. The outlooks, some would say, are too radically different and incompatible. Is that the case now? We're moving beyond Locke now into some kind of new understanding of liberalism, which does present a tension with Islam.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to, think of Locke and Mill in one sentence because I think they're very, very different kinds of thinkers. And I would also sort of agree with Hassan, I mean, in the sense that I'm not sure I would even call much of what we say today as liberalism as opposed to just licentiousness. I mean, I never think of Mill as a licentious figure.
No.
Mill understood the idea of higher goods and that there were certain things that were worth pursuing more than others, right? And I think what we see today, ironically, is despite the lip service to freedom that we hear all the time, we live in a most unfree society.
Yes.
In the sense that so much of our lives are determined by the logics of economic necessity. Most human beings don't have much choice about anything because the market is dictating everything for them. I think that's one reason why sexual freedom has become so important in modern culture, because it's the only domain in which the average person feels any kind of ability to govern himself or herself. And so it's not really a philosophical problem, it's a kind of sociological or anthropological problem that arises from the hyper-capitalism in which we live, in which there's no room for any other kind of freedom. And as a result, the only way people can experience any self-government is in their intimate lives. And so they resent anybody talking about it because nothing else is available to them, right? I mean, that's kind of my own pop psychology explanation of what's going on, because otherwise it's very hard for me to make sense of it, honestly.
But in terms of a Muslim response.
Right, and so again, I think Islamically, this is where I think Islam has a balance that Western culture lacks, is that we have an idea of privacy that is extremely important. So we have boundaries.
I mean, this is a really important point. If I may interrupt, could you just explain to some people in the audience who may not be aware of what is particularly Islamic about the privacy realm and the public realm? Because there's a very important distinction, isn't it, in the worldview, which we don't really have in the West so much these days.
So in traditional Islamic ethics, let me just say, Islam is a heteronormative religion. I mean, a lot of people will not like that, but it clearly is a heteronormative religion. On the other hand, Islam also is a religion that respects people's privacy. And Islam teaches Muslims not to pry into people's private, intimate lives. Right? And it allows for a certain kind of sociological balance to exist, in which sexual minorities can exist without persecution, while at the same time, the ethical ideals can be maintained for the reproduction of society. I mean, I would say everybody, no matter what their sexual orientation is, has an interest in healthy heteronormativity, because that's what reproduces society.
That's how they exist,
I mean, so even if you're not heterosexual,
that's how they exist.
Even if you're not heterosexual, you don't want heteronormative ideals to break down, because that will destroy the society in which you are in.
Although that is the objective of many activists today, is precisely to destroy that.
And so, but the problem in Western societies is there's no respect for limits. Right? So, I just know growing up, my God, the kind of abuse that would be hurled on someone who was suspected of being a sexual minority was horrific, right? Because again, there's no boundaries, right? And so once that's flipped over, it goes to the other extreme, right? So the view is the only way we can protect sexual minorities is to eliminate any kind of normativity around sexual ethics. right? Because otherwise the fear is if we have any kind of normative sexual ethics, we're back to the old days of sexual persecution.
Right.
So there's no ability to be balanced.
There's
the way
no
that I
middle
think
path here. It's all reactive for the pendulum
way-
swinging back and forth.
I
all
think
the time.
Islam offers a way to balance these two different goals, preventing persecution based on sexual orientation while maintaining some kind of ideal of sexual normativity.
Yeah, I mean, this plays back to what you were saying about the Kantian ethics being contentless, devoid of any content. And there's a wonderful verse in the Quran, which I'm not going to mention in Arabic, but in English translation. You are indeed the best community that has ever been brought forth for the good of mankind. You enjoin the doing of what is right and forbid the doing of what is wrong. And you believe in God. It's the Quran, the third surah, verse 110 in the Muhammad Asa translation. I think that's just wonderful because there you do have some content, at least the sense of a moral content, rather than just an individualistic free-for-all. And that's in the DNA of what it is to be a Muslim in a social context as an ethical individual. And I think that's just a very beautiful verse.
I'd absolutely agree with Dr. Muhammad about the flatness in terms of governance and in terms of fiqh in Islamic civilization. I think that's a very important and laudable thing. I'm reminded of the story of Sayyidina Umar when the son of the governor of Egypt had a race with a Copt, and the Copt had beaten him in the race. I think it was a horse race. It must have been a horse race. And he got he was ashamed and embarrassed in front of his friends, and he thought, well, I'm the son of the ruler and I'm a Muslim, and he actually started beating this Copt.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Gosh.
with a stick. And this got back to Sayyidina Umar, who summoned the son and the father, the governor of Egypt, and had the son publicly whipped in front of everyone for that transgression. So there was absolutely no sense of a hierarchy that somehow he was immune because of his political status or something like that. The Sharia was absolutely applicable to all. And I think really the important thing is when weighing up the relevance of Locke and Mill. Mill has a harm principle, and we have a harm principle. You might talk about the 5 necessities in our deen,
Which are, just to list them briefly.
well, which are the preservation of life, the preservation of
lineage,
the preservation of deen, the preservation of
property and intellect.
And intellect, yeah. I've got the order completely wrong, that's why it didn't come out right. It starts with intellect.
We got there at the end, didn't we?
Yeah, I got with doctors' help. But in any case, so we have a harm principle. The structures of governance and legislation are there to protect these absolutely crucial and important elements of human life. But I think the issue with someone like Mill, I think Mill's a complete genius, by the way. I think that he's an empiricist, and he basically on almost every single philosophical position, I disagree with him for whatever that's worth. But I acknowledge that he's a complete genius, and he's very fair-minded, unusually for someone on the other side, as it were. He has an amazing essay called an essay on Bentham and Coleridge.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I may disagree with you there. I mean,
Right.
J.S. Mill wrote on liberty. I'm referring to that particular book, this utilitarian work. And he is fair-minded when it comes to English people.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with you. No, I know what you're referring to.
But he was living in an era of colonialism when England just happened, I'm sorry, to rule the world.
Yeah.
And this balance, this noble ethic, did not extend to the rest of the world.
He says despotism is a legitimate form of government when dealing with barbarians.
That's an exact quote from J.S. Mill.
Yeah, very
And the reason I
sadly.
say this is not me being hard on J.S. Mill. He himself says this.
Yeah, and
he says this ethic is only really for Englishmen. Okay. So that's why I'm pushing
No,
back on what you say.
that's a different issue, but it's of course extremely problematic, and we'd have no difference of opinion in condemning that. But I'm just thinking in terms of his breadth of knowledge and his fair-mindedness, even though he takes a position that I don't agree with. But it's interesting that the harm principle and Rawls's broad philosophy are two of the only philosophies that you'll actually find cited in courts of law today. They're seen as being sufficiently neutral to actually be principles that somehow transcend the idea that there is this separation between law and objective morality.
Yes.
And I'm sure Dr. Fuddle would be able to qualify that or
No,
correct me.
I think it's. I just wanted to. I'm glad you brought up Rawls. One thing that's very. I mean, I'd like to point out again, in furtherance of my claim that a lot of what goes under the rubric of liberalism today is really just licentiousness.
Yes, I think it's a very profound point. We'll come back to this in a second, we may, about the idea, because the subtitle here is freedom from sin or freedom to sin, which ties into what you're saying.
So Rawls, for example, in political liberalism, absolutely emphasizes the indispensability of what Republicans call civic virtues.
Right.
So you can't have a liberal democratic state in the way that Rawls envisions it without cultivating certain positive virtues in the citizenry.
Right.
And this is, I think, one of the great problems that we have today, is because our understanding of freedom is so impoverished that we've lost the ability to understand that, things like truth and a commitment to truth, a commitment to reasoned argument, a commitment to honesty, all these things are not things that people are born with. It has to be cultivated, right? And one of the ironies, I think, of Rawls is that Rawls assumes he has a very
who is Rawls? Could you just
John
explain who he
Rawls is like the most famous liberal philosopher in the post-war era. And his important contribution is he gave a sort of moral account of democracy at a time when utilitarian theories had totally dominated the field. But one of the things that's very important in his theory of the stability of democracies, or the possibility of the stability of democracies, is his assumption that citizens are morally motivated to be democratic citizens.
Yes.
Right? The problem is that it seems to me, under modern conditions of market capitalism, market democracy, there's a real question whether or not liberal democracies like the United States, England, have lost the ability to reproduce the morality necessary to sustain self-government. I mean, how else do you explain the election of Trump? I mean, I think this is a serious problem for political philosophers. Rawls just assumes that we all have the capacity to be reasonable. He calls them, we need to be reasonable and we need to be rational. Reasonable is our ability, essentially, to act, to be other-regarding, to regard others as equal, and their interest to be the equal as morally valuable as our own, and that we're rational and that we can conceive of goals and we can pursue them well. If you have a society that lacks people who are reasonable, they're all egoists.
Yes.
Right? It's a mad society, right? And so I feel like we're quickly going into that direction, because we're losing the ability to be other-regarding, because the sources of other-regarding, teaching people how to be other-regarding, are being destroyed. I mean, religion is an important source, regardless, Islam, Christianity, all religions teach us to be other-regarding.
Yes.
But we literally don't have time even to be religious, most of us, right? Regardless of the religion we follow, right? We don't have time to read philosophy. If you're a secularist, right, you don't want religion, but you got to have philosophy. You got to have some source of morality that will teach you to be reasonable on Rawls's terms. But if you look at universities today, students don't want to study humanities because everything is reinforcing the lesson that humanities are worthless.
Gosh.
Right? So I think there's a real crisis what we have in liberal democracies, because it's not the moral basis of self-government is being taken away from society.
Can I introduce perhaps a controversial and slightly off-colour note here? The title of this is "Do What Thou Wilt?" ? And as has been said already, this is the creed of a Satanist. And I use that word in its technical sense rather than a pejorative sense, he's a bad person. Aleister Crowley, a fellow Englishman. The reason I mention this is that, is it not possible, and this is a controversial bit, to argue, and I think maybe Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has alluded to this actually, with perhaps some quite insightful comments, that behind the evident, the scene, as you have so eloquently described, the forces of market capitalism and the lack of altruism in our ethical interactions with people and the breakdown of normative value, absolutely, I'm not denying that, of course. But also, is there not an unseen realm of occult power, of influence, therefore, satanic influence? As Muslims or Christians, and we believe in Shaitan, Satan, the devil, whatever. And Aleister Crowley was very much in alignment with that ideology, this kind of egocentric, my desire is my God. There's a verse in the Quran that speaks about the man who makes his own desires his God. So could it be said, in fact, in addition to your own apparent, in terms of the external causes, which are real, we have another unseen element or dimension to this whole issue of a satanic perspective. I don't mean this as a metaphor, by the way. I mean this as a hard metaphysical reality. And this is not normally spoken of in ethics, is it? The influence of the devil. But but maybe it should be, because we're talking about individual lives here who are being influenced by the zeitgeist, which apparently is an expression of Aleister Crowley's philosophy. So we are living under this regime, it could be argued. I mean, is this fanciful, or would you see something to that, both of you?
I think that's just simply factual, that we are subject to the agency of the devil. He doesn't have any real power over us, but he has apparent power over us if we don't protect ourselves properly. Yeah. But I think that's a kind of, in a way, a different level of metaphysical causation to, what is up to us and we can deal with on this level, which is the rational level. Sure, he's definitely at work, very, very deep down in people. Right. And there are several verses in the Quran which speak to that. I mean, for example, one of the things that Satan likes to do is to inspire people to change God's creation. They're going to.
Yes. We're seeing this precisely this attempt in various aspects of our lives today.
Right, and the thing is that has a rational manifestation, and I feel that the phenomenon that Dr. Muhammad is talking about was referring to, which is, you might call, the crisis of liberal legitimacy today. I don't know whether we differ on that, but I think that's basically inevitable. It's been a long time in the making, but I think it was basically inevitable given the philosophies of modernity. One of the fundamental empiricism and metaphysical reductionism that you find in most of the theorists of modern liberalism. And I think it manifests even in Rawls, because when you have this idea of the priority of rights over the good, and that one of the most fundamental functions of a liberal society is non-interference and protecting the right of people to pursue their own visions of the good, right? To define and pursue their own visions of the good. I think there's a fundamental arbitrarism there, which is that it's impossible then to order goods. It's impossible to order one good over another. It also, there's a conundrum, this is widely discussed, which is, what is that prescription itself? Isn't that a definition of the good? The idea that autonomy itself is the ultimate good? Yes. And there are some thinkers like Joseph Raz, who liberal perfectionism, who think that actually autonomy itself is that good, which everyone has to be held accountable to. That is the good that we seek. That is the end that is sought, and that has to be imposed upon everyone.
I mean, in the Quran, it's not so much that freedom is lauded as a great virtue. It's justice, for example. It seems to be a very serious virtue in the Quran.
Justice is, but freedom is a very important virtue. I mean, Imam al-Ghazali, I was just reading in Mizan al-Amal. It's one of the texts that I'm very unworthily teaching at Zaytuna, and he said, al-hurr fi at-tahqiq man qahara shahwatahu. Right? He said the free person, in the final analysis, the free person is actually the person who has overcome and defeated his desire.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And I think freedom is that's a type of definition that you'll find. There's some very interesting definitions.
Yes.
Freedom's very important to our tradition. To be a mukallaf.
So that's not freedom to sin, that's freedom from sin, freedom from the controlling nafs, isn't it?
That's freedom from the controlling nafs and that's what I mean by hierarchy. It's not, some sort of imposition on people. Right. It's the fact that we find a hierarchy within ourselves.
Yes.
We don't want to be enslaved to impulse.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if we're sort of shifting now to talk about the Islamic tradition, I mean, I think you find both a commitment to the positive view of freedom that you just talked about with Imam Ghazali, but also a very strong commitment to negative freedom. Negative freedom, legitimate negative freedom, and even the negative freedom of sinners, right? So, first of all, in Islamic law, as a general rule, the idea of interfering in the rights of another person is completely not accepted. Right? That's considered a really major violation of your rights. If you find, if somebody might be doing stupid things, right? But if it's not illegal, you're not supposed to be able to stop that person from doing it. So again, Ibn Abd al-Salam says, حَجْرُ الْمَرْءِ عَنَ الْإِسْتِقْلَالِ بِمَنَافِعِ نَفْسِهِ مَفْسَدَةً. Right? This is a principle of fiqh. So rights bearers, that's what it means to be a right bearer, is that you get to pursue those rights as you wish, as long as you're not doing anything illegal, right? So the principle of non-interference is very, very important in fiqh. Secondly, Imam Qarafi has an interesting commentary on the hadith that, teach your children to pray at 7, and if they don't pray, I think at 10, you can beat them. He says, well, if he's 10 years old and he's not praying and you beat him, and he still doesn't pray, right? You don't keep beating him, right? Because it's a principle of punishment, that the punishment has to be effective, has to achieve some aim. And if the 10-year-old continues not praying, beating him clearly no longer is serving a corrective function. It becomes gratuitous, and gratuitous violence is not part of the Sharia, right? And so there's a certain amount of balance between, to use a Rousseauian term, forcing us to be free and then taking our responsibility as individuals to cultivate the virtues necessary to achieve self-mastery, right? And that requires a certain kind of negative freedom. So Imam Shatibi again says in the Muwafaqat in Kitab al-Maqasid that we're all the slaves of God, ittiraran, by necessity. But it's the aim of the lawgiver that we choose to be God's servants, that we become God's servants ikhtiyaran, right? And that's part of the art of politics, is that the ruler understands what the population is capable of living up to. So he reports an anecdote involving Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, who's considered one of the wise caliphs, and his son supposedly was berating him for his laxity in enforcement of the law. And he replied to his son, the problem is if I try to compel people to behave properly all at once, they might abandon the truth all at once, right? And his son was sort of expressing kind of deontic enthusiasm, let's say, right? And Umar ibn Abdul Aziz says that's not how a successful ruler rules. You rule by, understanding what the people are capable of obeying freely, and then you sort of raise them over time. This was part of Shatibi's argument that the Sharia becomes grounded in the community gradually over time, as they learn, as they assimilate it, internalize it, right? And so there's always this risk politically, and you see this with regimes that view themselves as transformative of human nature, that they devolve into tyrannies.
Yes, like the Soviet Union, the new Soviet man who
Yeah.
would become this new ontological being who, as you said, the Soviet Union just becomes a tyranny.
And so, Shatibi is very worried about that,
Yeah.
right? And he's talked about istitnas, the need to sort of domesticate the norms of the Sharia, which can only be acquired gradually over time in the lives of the subject in the lives of the legal subject, right? So you've got to have a balance between law as a sort of vehicle that uplifts people, raises them up, and law as a tool that protects them from the interference of others. You need to have both. You need to have a proper balance of both.
I mean, there's an amazing story. I think it was a hadith that when I first discovered as a new Muslim, it really impressed me. I think there was a story of a companion who was at home in his courtyard, the wall around it, and there were sort of noises from within the house that suggested he might be partying and so on. And so a companion peeped over and looked and threatened to denounce him or basically expose him as a transgressor. And in fact, when he attempted to do so, he was rebuked because the privacy aspect was actually, whatever this guy was doing at home was private, even if it was
really
wrong.
Important,
and
yeah.
to spy on someone was the far worse offence in that particular context. And I thought, wow, that's a very sophisticated understanding of negative freedom as you were describing it.
That's precisely what I was going to say in an agreement with Dr. Muhammad's words. The famous story, and there are many others, the famous narration about Sayyidina Umar who was going around Medina doing his hisba activity, just making sure everything's all right. And they heard, it's late at night, and they hear people partying, basically.
Yes.
Loud, reveling noises,
Yeah.
and the clink of glasses and things like that. And they actually see through a jar. There's a door which is ajar, and they actually see people drinking.
Wow.
They actually see Muslims drinking. And he says to his companion, what do you think we should do? And the companion says, I think that, his advisor says, I think we should leave because we've been spying. And this is covered by wala tajassasu.
Yes.
It's actually because we peered in the door, even though there's so much overwhelming evidence, we'd actually be guilty of transgression of spying.
This is a Sharia principle, isn't it? It's not some kind of.
This is a very fundamental Sharia principle, but it ties into something which I think is really relevant to the broader context, which is just this idea. Look, in Islam, actually, you are free to pursue your own vision of the good. Under the regime of Islam in the broader sense, you are free to pursue your own vision of the good. What you're not free to do is to pursue that, to pursue sin publicly.
Right. Publicly.
You're free to pursue it privately because there's a prohibition of tajassus. I mean, that's not. No one needs to tell you that. You're a human. You can do what you want.
You can get away with it.
Yeah, you can. That's the human condition.
But not ultimately, of course, because God is watching at all times. This is a legal point, I guess, rather than a metaphysical point, because we're always observed.
Well, this is the issue. If you look at the way that, for example, homosexuality was legalized in private in the UK,
Yes.
right, in about 1959, late 50s. First, there was the Wolfenstein Committee,
Yes.
which weighed up, how we should deal with this in terms of legislation. And there were two major participants in the paper. There was Devlin,
Yes.
and there was Hart. And Hart was arguing that no, it should remain illegal, and Devlin was arguing for that, and Hart was arguing based on invoking the harm principle, and in their eventual recommendation that it should be legalized
Or decriminalised, I think.
decriminalized
as opposed to
is the word.
legalised.
Yeah,
It's just
decriminalized.
like-
Yeah, sorry, decriminalized. They explicitly invoked. Again, invoking a philosopher, they explicitly invoked Mill's harm principle.
Right.
Now, Devlin tried to... Now, in the first place, that was supposed to be in private, right?
Yes.
Now, that's already...
setting out what's in private.
That's already taken care of in Islam in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, in England, they used to literally beat down the doors in order to discover people. So that's why it was relevant in that sense.
Yes.
But what subsequently happened is obviously as you say, the obligatory morality that we all are forced to say, it has to become our credo. I believe the sacred orthodoxy of the zeitgeist, one of which is that homosexuality and heterosexuality are formally equivalent because they are basically just the objects of people's wills. They are their own conception of the good, and who are we to say that one is superior to the other? And that's the ultimate consequence of there not being a criterion for the good, yes. Right? There only being a conception of rights, yes. Right? So we have human beings have a right to privacy, and they have a right ultimately before God because they're answerable to God. If they're just in God's presence and no one's watching them, they can do whatever they want. That's the human condition. But what you don't have a right to do is to bring it into public and promote it. Yes. As somehow something equivalent to other options which are normative. So, I think that is again a fundamental. This is what we mean fundamentally by hierarchy. That there is a nature of things, there is an order of being, and there's an objective ordering in goods as well, of goods. So I just thought that's a very interesting debate, the one between Devlin and Hart, because Hart and the decriminalization side ultimately wins out. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have. As I said, that principle in a way is already there in Islam, that yes. Right to privacy. But what I'm saying is it's interesting if you look at the attempts that were made to argue for the opposite position, because of the deterioration, breakdown of any form of metaphysically rooted philosophical ethics, all he could invoke was custom. He said, well, this is a Christian country, and legislation should take into consideration, the customs of a country. He was saying al-adda muhakkama, basically. And, custom has the power of law, which is an Islamic principle. And so we should take into consideration the fact that most people would disagree with this. Yes. The position of the average man in the street is relevant. Well, the funny thing is that is to invoke complete relativism, because the position of the average man in the street today is the exact opposite.
And it's also highly manipulative, highly open to be manipulated by media and so on. So it's not a stable, unchanging phenomenon. But perhaps we need to move on as time is pressing on us. My penultimate question, really, as we draw to a close, gentlemen, can you sum up the main points of your respective positions? I think there is a difference, but although you're being very amicable, which is very interesting. But could you perhaps just summarise your views on this? And then and the final question basically is to, if people want to explore these issues, ideas further, what articles or books would you recommend that we read? So it's kind of, there's the final two questions. So Mohammed, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not quite so convinced that liberalism is vacuous. I mean, again, I'm not a philosopher. I know liberalism through Rawls, and Rawls's conception of how a politically liberal society can be stable depends on the idea that there are certain substantive moral values that are held in common by different traditions. I think this is very important, that maybe sort of traditional political philosophy rooted the stability of a just regime in the populace sharing one ethical conception of the good. Rawls believes, and I'm sympathetic to this belief, at least in the West, is that that idea of a moral unity of the people is sociologically unrealistic. And there has to be a different explanation or a different route to stability. His argument is that you can have a pluralism of commitments that nevertheless share certain goods in common.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And I think actually that is a very clever argument. And I also think it happens to have the virtue of being true. I think the major ethical traditions of the world, whether philosophical or religious, do converge on really, really important values. What concerns me is that he kind of assumed, I think, unrealistically, that this kind of the ethical commitments of the people will just stay, will just survive, sort of by, I don't know, by what's the word in physics? Inertia, right? But I think he really underestimated the destructive power of market capitalism, because market capitalism is all about hawa. It's all about hawa. It's all about immediate gratification of desire. And no philosopher is going to endorse that, right? Certainly, I mean, Rawls wouldn't endorse that. You can't be a reasonable person in Rawls's conception if your most important personality trait is gratification, immediate gratification of desire, right? So I think there's got, from a practical perspective, we can't save liberal democracy. The threat to liberal democracy is not the absence of a common theory of the good. It's that unrestrained market capitalism destroys our capacity to adopt any conception of the good.
Right.
For the average person, because we're too busy consuming.
Yeah, no, that's very profound. Hassan?
Jazakallah khairan. I very fundamentally agree with Dr. Muhammad. I think Rawls, as so many other thinkers who appeared at a certain moment in history, they didn't realize that they were really banking on the survival of what was really fundamentally a Christian Victorian ethic, that would just by default
they're living off that capital, inherited capital, which is already dissipating by secularization.
Precisely, and I do believe that our problem in today's world, in so many different areas, is the loss of metaphysics, and it really is that there was if you don't have Christian belief to fall upon, in which, let's say, at least you have fear of punishment in an afterlife, or reward, or hope for reward in an afterlife, which was what Locke, if you get past his ethical arbitrarism when it comes to pure philosophy, that's what he ends up leaning upon, is that that's the only way to get people to act morally. Otherwise, as far as he's concerned, the philosophers of old did in vain inquire whether summum bonum is whatever it happens to be. You may as well decide, you may as well ask whether lobsters and cheese are better, because just that while they're wonderful fare to some individuals, they're absolutely repugnant to others. And that was his view of ultimately on our ethical judgments. And you find that in the book on power in his famous essay. So that's what it comes down to, is an ultimate arbitrarism because of his empiricism. How do you order moral and ethical goods in a metaphysically grounded way if you're fundamentally an empiricist?
It's interesting. Even John Locke, the great John Locke, who influenced, I understand, the United States Constitution in some ways, was really against atheists. I mean, they would they were not permitted to.
They were the only people. Atheism. Atheists and Catholics couldn't be tolerated.
He's a great apostle of freedom, but he
is. I mean, again, Locke is a divine command theory. Fellow, right? That at the end he believes that the only thing that grounds ethics is the divine command. Right. And so, anyway.
Okay. So my second question, finally, was if people want to explore your thought or these ideas further, what would you recommend in terms of articles or books for people to read?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say. I don't know.
Because you've written on this, obviously. I've read some of
I'd recommend Dr. Fuddle's some of
his
articles.
That's just Google his name and you can read some articles.
One's on Renovatio, so that's very easy.
That's very...
Yes, in the House Journal of Zaytuna, you have actually written some articles, so that's a good place to start. Unless you had something else.
I think Rawls is very accessible. Political Liberalism Revisited. Political Liberalism Revisited is an article, but I find actually the book, Political Liberalism, just the introduction even, to be quite accessible. And it's important, I think, for Muslims living in liberal societies to understand the basic architecture of liberal political philosophy. Because that's the governing ideology, right? And you know, I don't read as much as I used to. I've got so much time. I have to read for my writing, for purposes of research. I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Yes.
And I think there are a lot of valuable podcasts that bring writers and scholars. And I encourage people to find good podcasts. There's the political theory podcast, which I listen to, others as well, including Islamic studies. There's the New Books in Islamic Studies podcast. All these things. You need to, you know, to be a high-functioning Muslim citizen in the United States and Canada or England. You just, you know, you have to be really well read,
Yes.
I think. And so I encourage people to increase their Islamic knowledge and increase their secular knowledge.
Gosh, that sounds like good advice. Thank you. Hassan?
I recommend blogging theology.
Oh, do you? That's right. I gave him a 10 quid earlier to say that, so thank you.
I have just finished doing the bibliography for my book, which is in press at the moment, so do look out for it. But it's you know, one definite recommendation is Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation. Absolutely fantastic book, which just talks about how what started out as a very, very religious indeed, religious revolution. Really, I mean, he traces the emergence of secularism from the Protestant Revolution, and you know, of course
Martin Luther, the Two Kingdoms, which is often seen as...
Yeah, of course, the Two Kingdoms, and then, you know, culminating in the Peace of Augsburg and the Peace of Westphalia, and then the emergence of the modern nation state, and so on, and you know, then the doctrine of tolerance in Locke, which of course
apart from atheists and Catholics, but yeah.
Apart from atheists and Catholics, which not everyone knows, you know, is founded in his epistemological skepticism. Since we can't know the truth of the matter, it would be unjust for us to impose any one vision on. So there are a lot of dogmatic assumptions parading as neutrality, which may not be. And that's, you know, these are all open to contention. But I'm just saying, you know, look into that. The Unintended Reformation. Other works, I would definitely recommend Robert Pippin's Modernism as a Philosophical Problem. That's a fantastic, absolutely fantastic work. If you've got a lot of time on your hands, or you're a very, you know, you're looking for the long haul, then read Taylor's A Secular Age. It's about like 9,000 pages or something, but it just never ends.
It's a very, very long haul flight
Yeah.
from here to where we are.
Yeah, exactly, to Australia or something.
Australia,
but that's a very, very worthwhile book. His Sources of the Self. I can't pronounce his name. It might be Schneewind or something, but it's The Invention of Autonomy. I hope he forgives me for pronouncing his name like that. But The Invention of Autonomy, for a really detailed history. After Virtue is a favourite here
Alistair McIntyre, another
at
British
Zaytuna, thanks to Dr. our provost's leadership. He's established After Virtue. It's a very important text as a key text. And of course, you're probably familiar with the argument of After Virtue, which is that we're in a complete mess in terms of morality and moral language. And you know, modernity is prescribing forms of morality, suggesting forms of morality and ethics for us, which it's also suggesting we can't possibly take seriously. So it's this kind of contradiction.
Okay, well, I'm going to recommend a book that I've nearly finished myself. It's just been published, called Islam, Liberalism and Ontology, a critical re-evaluation by Joseph J. Kaminsky, who's a professor. He's actually an American professor, published by Routledge Studies in Religion and Politics. It covers much of the ground that we've covered. He has very definite conclusions, though, but it's a very scholarly work, and I recommend that, Islam, Liberalism and Ontology. And with that, we will conclude. Thank you very much indeed to you two. And a round of applause.
Great discussion.
Thank you.
That was so much fun.
Very nice.